I'm Shelley Pryor and welcome to my studio. Today I'm going to talk about something that a lot of watercolor artists tend to avoid, and that is stretching your paper. It doesn't matter if you're just a beginner or if you're a professional. Professionals certainly do get into the habit of stretching your watercolor paper, but you should do it even if you're a beginner because it makes things a lot easier to paint because you're not going to have the rippling of the paper, and it's just a good habit to get into. What if one of your pieces turns out and you want to put it into a show? So let's get started. I'm going to begin with a few materials, and we don't need too much for this, but some of the materials you're going to be using are going to be very important. We're going to be using water and a sponge. We're going to be using a standard stapler for this. I'm stretching 140-pound cold press paper made by Arches, but there are a lot of other really nice brands out there. Arches just happens to be my favorite. But I want to talk a little bit about the board that you use, because the board you use is important, because if you are using a very hard type of board, it can be very difficult to staple into, and you'll probably end up having to use one of these bad boys, which is a heavy-duty stapler. And the staples are, first of all, they're difficult to put in, but they're equally difficult to take out. So I'm using a plywood that is soft enough that I can use a standard stapler, and just to test it out here, I can try it in the corner and press down, and that staple went into the board just fine. So whatever kind of board you decide to use, make sure that you can staple into it before you start wetting your paper or anything else. I've used a 1/4 poplar plywood that I've got at the local hardware store, although it's actually about 3/8 of an inch thick, even though they call it 1/4 inch. But it's got a smooth surface. But before you do any stretching on your board, you want to make sure that you make it waterproof. So you're going to put several coats of a varnish, whatever kind of varnish you need. The idea is just to get it to be waterproof. Put a few coats front, back, and on your edges as well. So you're going to seal the entire board. And then you're going to have that ready to stretch. I have one in a size that's a little bigger than a 1/4 sheet, a little bigger than a 1/2 sheet, and of course a little bigger than a full-size sheet. So I've always got something ready. That's the worst part of stretching your watercolor paper, is preparing some boards to put it onto. But once you have them, you have them. And the actual process of stretching your paper is very, very easy. All right, so we're going to start with our paper. You're going to look for the watermark that's on the paper where it says Arches or Fabriano or whatever brand you happen to have. And when it's right reading, that is the front side of the paper. So I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to wet first the back side of the paper. And here's a mistake that a lot of people make, is they don't get their paper nearly wet enough. So I'm going to use my sponge, and I'm not even wringing it out here. I'm just bringing my dripping sponge, sopping wet, and I'm going to put it water all over my paper. It's going to slip around a little bit here because the other side's still dry, but we're going to be flipping this over in a second. The idea is you want to saturate the paper, not just the surface front and back, but all the way through to the core. The fibers of watercolor paper are cotton, and they're very, very absorbent. So you may be surprised, especially if you're new to watercolor, you may be surprised at how much water this paper can hold. So I'm going to flip it over. In fact, maybe I'll just wet the board for extra insurance here, and I'm going to flip it over. So now this is the right side of the paper, and I'm going to fully saturate this side as well. I'm getting a lot of water everywhere, but that's okay. I'll use some paper towels and clean that up. You want to make sure that you've got even coverage. You cover everything. I'm also not really scrubbing the paper. I don't want to damage the surface in any way or take off all the sizing. So now I have, as you can see by the shine, it's very, very wet. And before you begin any stapling, you want to make sure that you have enough staples to finish the job. Okay, so at this point, what I want to do is I want to staple all edges of the board and the paper as close to the edge as I can get. I'm going to put my staples about 1 to 2 inches apart. Almost at the edge, so I'll put another one in for insurance. And I will turn my board because I always want the stapler being on the outside of the paper, not on the paper. So I keep turning my board as I go. And I just continue all the way around. The last side. And that's all there is to it. My watercolor paper is already stretched. Of course it has to dry. You could speed up the drying time with your blow dryer. Using a blow dryer also adds heat to your paper, so that will also aid in the shrinking of the paper. The more your paper shrinks in the drying process, the tighter it will be and the less prone to the wrinkling. But before it dries, it's going to get worse. It's going to wrinkle a lot more. Here's one that I did a few minutes ago, and you can see it's got a big buckle right in the middle, and so this is actually feels a little bit dry on the surface, but because it's still wet in the core or perhaps on the back of this paper, it still hasn't dried completely yet. So you'll know it's completely dry when the paper's completely flat again. So when you go to paint on a paper that's been stretched, it's going to be a lot nicer. You're not going to have as much paint settling into valleys, where the ripples are. You're not going to have paint settling in there, and it's just in the overall going to have a better look. So it's something that you probably aren't doing, but you should be doing. And maybe once you have a couple of boards ready, you'll get into the habit of it, because it really is a good idea. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, I hope you'll give me a thumbs up. I hope you'll share, subscribe, and I welcome any comments or questions. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.